welcome to Fintech Firebrand. I'm Virginie O'Shea, founder of Firebrand Research, and I'm here to chat to you about August's and July's Fintech and FinReg news. Now, I can't start this month's episode without mentioning that half of Europe is probably on holiday at the moment. Unfortunately, we've had quite a hot summer in some parts of Europe. In the UK, it's been pretty wet. But it has brought home the topic of climate change. And on that note, we've seen a lot of progress in the last few weeks, I must admit, on the topic of ESG regulation. Now, one of the most recent developments is at the EU level. The European Council has finally approved some of the technical standards for the corporate sustainability reporting directive. So that's been in the cards for a little while. There's been a lot of discussion. There's been a lot of industry pushback towards some of the proposals. And finally, at the end of July, we saw final rules being published for disclosures with regards to ESG components. It's been noted by the European Commission that there's been a lot of red tape. It's been quite challenging for firms. There's been a lot of pushback for firms about the amount of disclosures they have to make. So there has been some watering down, someone might say, of some of the requirements. And the CSRD, not CSDR, importantly, the directive applies to annual reports from 2024. So it's upcoming relatively soon next year. So for the largest corporates out there, corporate issuers, it'll apply to the smaller ones a couple of years later. But certainly there has been a lot of toing and froing on the discussions with the accounting boards with regards to the final rules. And there are a fair number of details in there that people are having to pay attention to. So people will be digesting this over the summer break, I'm sure. You've been given some reading material from the European Commission. This nearly always happens just before the end of July. We see a download of lots of regulatory proposals and the finalising of certain rules, likewise in the US. But before I get to that, another interesting development at the end of the month and starting this month has been the Shareholder Rights Directive review. Now, that process has been ongoing for a year and a bit. The directive came into force, the second SRD2 came into force in 2020. The review process kicked off a year later. And now we're seeing the results of the consultation process. The ESMA received around about 73, I think it was, responses from the industry about the governance issues that were raised in SRD2. And all of that feedback has now been turned into some proposals that were published by ESMA and the European Banking Authority. And the industry now has time to read through those proposals. The long and the short of some of the proposals are we've seen discussion at last about harmonising the definition of shareholder across the EU markets. That's been a pain point for years. I think the Giovannini barriers back in 2001 mentioned it. So certainly it's something that the industry has been aware of. It can be problematic from a tax and fund administration standpoint. So certainly that will be well received by the industry. Less well received by the industry could be some of the pushback that the regulators have around the adoption of machine readable formats. There's been some, let's say the word flexibility in certain jurisdictions about what kinds of formats are permitted. I think the ESMA and the EU level authorities are keen to see that flexibility driven out so that ISO 20022 formatted messages are the format of choice for message delivery for things like shareholder transparency and proxy voting confirmations. Another area that might be less popular, particularly with proxy advisory firms, is the proposal for more transparency around proxy advice. Now, this is an interesting topic that was brought up during ESG month last month by the anti-ESG contingent in the US. The Republican demographic that are very much anti-ESG seem to be agreeing or on the same or similar page to the pro-ESG contingent in Europe around this topic and the influence of proxy advisors and the need for more transparency there in reporting. So certainly there are some proposals in the SRD document around that. with regards to registration requirements for those proxy advisors as well. It's interesting to note that the two largest providers are viewed as US, but even though one is owned by a large CSD in Europe, or majority owned by one, but certainly there's a lot of pushback with regards to the influence of those two large firms, and it'll be interesting to see the upshot of some of those discussions going forward over the next few months. Another huge topic turning to the US this month has been the going into this month, the Federal Reserve. The US Federal Reserve Board had a meeting at the end of the month titled Basel III Endgame, which makes it sound like something from the Avengers. Unfortunately, it's not. It's about implementing the Basel requirements within the US markets to address some of the ongoing capital and risk sort of market practices that need to be updated. Now, the US, if you remember, has not really fully adopted Basel II, so is some way behind on the Basel Accords versus the rest of the world. So this is sort of long overdue. It does look, though, however, that like the US is going a little step further, maybe adding some gold plating with regards to the capital requirements. Now, it's interesting to note, obviously, with the challenges we've seen in the mid-tier banking sector in the US over recent months. I've been mentioning this for a while, but some of those woes are going to be addressed in this area, looking at adding more capital requirements for the mid-tier banks as well as the GSIBs, the globally systemically important banks, who tend to take the brunt of all of these requirements. The GSIBs obviously are going to be targeted, so capital requirements are predicted to increase by about 24% for the GSIBs and about 11% in terms of risk-weighted assets for the mid-tier. So banks very much in the same vein as the banks that have been facing difficulties throughout the start of the year. So there's also some interesting dynamics with regards to some of the changes there underlying, and it may be beneficial in some areas as mortgage-backed securities are less weighted than expected, though derivatives are somewhat more punitive. So there's going to be a lot of industry pushback. There's already been pushback. This decision was taken while a lot of people are about to go on holiday, so it's an interesting timing with regards to the publication and discussion. If you want to read the Basel III Endgame, it's around about 1,600 pages, so a bit of a summer read for you if you're interested, and certainly it will be much digested over the summer period, and I expect it to be a topic throughout the rest of the year as well. Could pose some opportunities for firms helping in that space, consultants, vendors in the risk management space in particular, especially those that are targeting the American market. Another interesting dynamic this month, although not strictly capital markets, has been the furore around Coutts closing the bank account of a particular high-profile UK politician or ex-politician, polarising Nigel Farage. So certainly there was a lot of discussion, and going into August, there has been some more discussion and resignations of two of the involved bank CEOs. Around this, there's been sort of pushback around and discussion within the political sphere about whether KYC requirements should be amended, which is a bit of a daft conclusion to be taking with regards to this stuff. But certainly it looks like there may be more changes ahead to how clients are assessed with regards to accounts, largely in the retail space. But you'll also note that this month Consumer Duty came into force in the UK, and now that regime is also focused on protecting retail clients, including retail investors. I think I mentioned it on an earlier session that we had, and certainly that is going to be interesting with regards to retail investments and disclosures and transparency in that space, as well as influencing this issue with regards to bank account opening. And for my final thoughts for the month, there's been a lot of discussion about ChatGPT, generative AI. I'm sure I've had final words on this before, but certainly the regulatory sphere has been talking about it more and more. BNP Paribas just put out a report highlighting how much hedge funds are using it for marketing materials. Now, I'm sure I talked about this last month, but certainly I expect these discussions to go on and on and on, particularly with regards to intellectual property and exactly how data privacy is going to be maintained in this space. So expect new vendors to be popping up in this sphere, targeting this particular type of deployment with regards to support for marketing and how data is used, how information is used, what models are trained on, and how the information is inputted and processed could be somewhat controversial as well. So certainly expect that ChatGPT is not going to go away anytime soon. There's lots of competitors to it. There's a lot of discussion about it. I expect that to be a top discussion point going into sort of heavy conference season when we're back in September. And on that note, I will be attending Sibos this year. I'm looking forward to it. So I'm going to be on a panel with regards to funds tokenization, looking at the future of tokenization and why it may not have taken off as much as people expected. And I'm also going to be talking about the most painful of acronyms, the unique transaction identifier, and how that can improve transparency across the security settlement space. So I look forward to seeing some of you there. Hit me up, drop me a line if you're going to be there. It'd be great to catch up and have a meeting.